Hi everybody and welcome to a Heel Heat review show. My name is George Coles. This is my tag team partner, Scott Flash Norton.
Gary Rhodes, everybody.
And today, if you guys haven't guessed, we're going to be reviewing the new DVD, nWo The Revolution. It just was put out on Tuesday. It's the newest recap of the nWo that the WWE has put out.
I like this version a lot better than the original one.
The Back in Black?
Yes, because it actually goes through a lot more of the WCW days and really doesn't talk a lot about the WWE times. It appears to me that the first one was more for WWE.
Well, it came out right as they came out in WWE, so they were built hyping that. But to get the actual DVD started, it showed the beginnings of the faction. Some of it was recycled footage from the other show. Not too much in the whole DVD. There's not too much recycled at all. A lot of it's new interviews or parts of interviews that they've never used before.
Yeah, and that's a great thing about it too, because we were kind of like on the fence about getting this one, but kind of glad we did. I like this one.
It was really good. It talked about Hall and Nash, both their contracts coming up and jumping to WCW. They went over this on the other one as well, but they went in a little bit more detail on here. Then they go right into the Bash in the Beach angle, which is when Hulk Hogan joins in, does the biggest heel turn, in my opinion, in the history of wrestling. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say at that point it was the biggest.
Well, the only thing that could compare would be if John Cena jumps now.
Yeah.
And
I think CM Punk's heel turn was pretty big, but it gradually changed over where Hogan just went out there and boom, dropped the leg on
Savage.
The switch. Boom. Top heel.
And then here's something that they talked about on this one that they never talked about on the first one. The expansion of the nWo and how so many people were being added. Guys like Scott Flash Norton, Mr. Perfect, Buff Bagwell,
and
Vincent.
And there's one point in there where they mentioned the Disco Inferno, and Dusty Rhodes goes, "Well, we ain't gonna talk about that."
Yeah, they showed Dusty Rhodes' turn, which was a very short time, but he was still there. There's even a shot of Louis Spicolli in here, so they covered a lot more of how it expanded, and then and eventually became half the roster was nWo.
They mentioned one part that like they had like 8 limos and like everybody in there was nWo members and stuff like that.
Yeah, and they did go a little bit further into the backstage on how people were literally fighting to become part of the nWo because they knew if they were nWo they had FaceTime on the show
and more money. They even mentioned part where they said some people offer, joking around, of course, offered their firstborn to be a part of the nWo.
Yeah, exactly. And they went in and this was something that I hadn't really thought about. Watching it back, I was a younger guy. I was probably 96. I was 19 years old.
I was 18.
So when nWo hit, I was 19 years old. It never, like, the significance didn't kick into me at the time, but the realism in the nWo and their attacks. And it's something they mentioned here. I never really thought about it, how realistic they looked. How it didn't look like a wrestling angle, it looked like a gang fight.
And the one part of this, too, it explains why they went to the black and white. They cut a promo one time, Hogan, Hall, and Nash, and Hall and Nash weren't really buying it because it didn't really look real.
Well, they didn't like how Hogan did it.
Yeah, Hogan's cutting a wrestling promo, and they're trying to make it like a real promo, like sit there, talk to you like we're talking. And stuff like that, and the editing guy goes, "I'll fix this, trust me."
And that's where
genius.
That's where they came up with the quick cut black and white videos, which, like he said, they were genius. They were revolutionary. It was something so different. And then they mentioned this on the DVD because WCW is all about pyrotechnics, hyper colors. Everybody had neon. If you watch the Bash at the Beach match, they all got like bright neon colors on. The ropes were purple. Everything was bright and flashy, and then all of a sudden, black and white grainy video. It was almost like a Quentin Tarantino video in the middle of the show.
I think whoever, the editor or the guy that was editing all that, he should have gotten an award for what he did.
I believe it was Craig Leathers, wasn't it?
I think so, you mentioned that, yeah.
They don't mention it on the DVD, that's just thinking. I think, if I'm wrong, let me know. And then they did talk about something on here. Again, another thing they didn't cover on the Back in Black DVD, the Sting versus the NWO angle. They were really positive on it. The other one barely covered it at all. The only thing, a little bit of a regret I had about it, was they didn't talk about how at the end it failed so badly with the Starrcade match.
Well, the Starrcade match really ruined a lot of it for me. Because, you know, Sting should have got over clean.
Yeah, instead
and you've mentioned that before, too. It really kind of killed the year-and-a-half build for this match, and it turns to shit. I just didn't really care for that part of it.
No, and I think that's when that's when more people went and started watching more of Monday Night Raw than they were watching WCW Nitro.
Well, it was a lack of direction in the company. Yeah. You had a lot of things that were going on that shouldn't have gone on. I think a lot of it had to do with the guaranteed contracts a lot of these guys had.
And the creative control.
Exactly. You should never let a performer have creative control over their character.
No, I mean, limited creative control is okay.
You can have a stake in it. But
Steve Austin had limited creative control, and there was a few times he said no. Famously, the I'm taking my ball and going home time, when he didn't want to drop the Brock Lesnar. And the point, and I thought it was a great point on his behalf, is Brock Lesnar versus Stone Cold Steve Austin's not a free TV match. That's a pay-per-view match.
Mm-hmm.
And the lack of direction, they really talk about it here. Cody Rhodes, who's interviewed profusely on the video,
which I liked.
Yeah, I liked that they brought Cody into it. It gave it a little bit, because Dusty was such a big part of WCW and the NWO at the time. Cody said even as an 11-year-old kid watching it, and when we watched it, we seen it. And if you guys are old enough that you actually watched the NWO, you seen it on the weekly shows, that literally the angles would start and stop. And I said this to you as we're watching it, as they're going through the timeline. Giants in one week, Giants out the next week. Giants in again,
and
Giants out again.
That seems to be Paul White's career, though, really. If you look at his WWE career, it's been pretty much the same thing. If they would ever made a mind to just keep him a monster or keep him funny, it would sell.
Yeah, but that's the thing with the NWO. Everybody was like that. They didn't know what they were doing with Bret Hart when he came in. They didn't know what they were going to do with, all the guys they had in there. They never really had anything for Scott Norton to do other than be there.
No, and the thing is, you got like 20 guys that are in your faction.
Yeah. And fake Sting should only ran 3 months, but he was running with them for over a year.
Exactly. You have all these guys in that faction, and it was just like, well, here, we'll work this guy this week. Kurt Hennig. We'll work Kurt Hennig this week, and we'll put him against Bill Goldberg. And we'll put this guy. There was no direction to that. You have so many guys and so many great workers that they just got lost in the mess.
I'm gonna make you pop right now, GR. This might be your favorite thing I'll ever say on any heel heat show ever.
What's that?
I really enjoyed in the NWO. It's not something in the DVD. Well, they mentioned it a little bit. Joe Hennig, who they called Joe Hennig instead of Michael McGillicuddy, so maybe when he comes back, he's coming back as Joe Hennig. But he mentions how his dad enjoyed working with Rick Rude, and if you remember, they almost exclusively worked with each other as part of the NWO. That was one of my favorite parts of the NWO, was the Kurt Hennig and Rick Rude pairing. I thought they were absolutely great together. I really think that WCW should have gave Kurt Hennig a World Heavyweight Championship at that time.
Holy crap, I never thought I'd hear that.
I like to give his favorite wrestlers Kurt Hennig, and I like to give him shit. I really do like Kurt Hennig a lot. I think he's a tremendous wrestler that never got his due, but I just like to give him shit because
he's one of them guys that's always been impersonated. And, back then, if he would have had a world title run, I think it would have went.
It was almost like they were a faction inside of the faction.
Yeah, and I like the way they work together. And even Joe brings up the fact that Kurt would watch tapes when he got home from performing and watch them with Joe, and just crack up at some of the stuff that him and Rude would do, or just a lot of the stuff, and he'd fast forward, rewind, just keep doing stuff like that.
They barely touched on the angle with the Four Horsemen where they make fun of them, which was something they covered extensively in the other DVD. They covered more, so I understand why they didn't on this. The next thing they really talked about was the celebrity involvement, which brought in Dennis Rodman, Karl Malone, and Jay Leno. And at the time, if you guys remember, Dennis Rodman was one of the biggest stars, sports, wrestling. He was everywhere. He had a #1 selling book.
Malone was awesome, though. I think you even mentioned it, that they even said
he was a natural.
Yeah, he could have been a professional wrestler. And if you really look at the match, the tag match they had with Hogan and Rodman, Malone and DDP, those two look like a real tag team.
Yeah. Well, they had matching gear.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying the way they performed. It wasn't like, okay, we got this guy here, just put him in an armbar for 10 minutes, tag in. Kind of like the Leno match, was just basically armbar, okay, here. But it's like the time...
headlock.
Yeah, well, speaking of Leno, and we were mentioning that part, it was like, what was that, Road Wild or...
Yeah, it's whatever one they did in Sturgis. Hog Wild, Road Wild, something like that.
Speaking of arm bars, when Leno had Hogan in the arm bar, and he's holding it, and there was like, why is he holding it so long? Or who was it that was saying, why is he holding it so long? I think DDP or somebody in the back, and it was just so all the cameras could get pictures of Leno having Hogan in the arm bar.
Yeah. Which is crap, but it did bring more viewers. This was at the absolute height of wrestling's popularity. In WCW, you got the nWo happening. In WWE, WWF at the time, you got the Stone Cold era starting. And
DX,
also,
you got...
DX, Rock, Mankind, Goldberg starts up. I mean, this was wrestling was as hot as it ever been, and a lot of it's contributed to the nWo, which is rightfully so.
Well, another person that was an integral part of that time too, and he was part of the nWo, against the nWo, went to WWF, worked for the corporation, was the big boss man too.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a very integral part, and he never got a lot of credit he deserves.
No,
and they actually mentioned him, or not mentioned him as much as, but
they show him
a lot when he turned and went to the nWo.
Yeah, and another guy that I wanted to speak, I mentioned it as we watched this DVD, was Six X-Pac, the Kid. I think when Bischoff fired X-Pac, not only did the WWE gain that character when he came back and joined DX, they gained that, but the nWo lost some of their edge, because out of everybody in the nWo, he was by far the edgiest character.
And speaking of that, when
he helped the Attitude Era.
Yeah, he did, and it really hurt them. Another thing that hurt them was when they went to Wolfpack Hollywood.
Yeah, and splintered it.
And then when X-Pac left, Hall had to do the jobs of jobbing more, which I even said that before, is Hall's biggest problem back then was saying no. He couldn't say no. Yeah. And what's your job to this guy?
And they talk about it in this, when they went to Wolfpack versus the nWo Hollywood, it became a wrestling angle instead of a cultural angle.
Yeah, the realism.
The realism disappeared, because now it's okay. It's good guys versus bad guys again, whereas before it was the nWo was something totally different than WCW.
Yeah. I just didn't really care for it. I kind of liked it then, but looking back up on it now, I think that really hurt the nWo more than it helped.
Well, and then they also talked about the failed reunions they had in WCW when after the finger poke of doom, they put them back as, what was it, the nWo Elite they called it at that time. And it was just 6 of them. I think it was a Hall.
They had the other members, but they would ride in separate cars for a little bit, stuff like that.
Well, they never used them really.
No.
It was only 6 guys were the Elite. It was Hall, Nash, Luger, Hogan, and Steiner, and Buff Bagwell. That was the Elite.
Stevie Ray and all them were kind of they were phasing them out.
Yeah, and they kind of just went their own way. And then after that, they did the nWo 2000 when they brought in Jeff Jarrett and Bret Hart.
No, Vince Russo, which was actually on this DVD, matter of fact. Actually, we just mentioned 2 guys who were on the DVD. What really shocked us was Russo and Lex Luger.
Both with new interviews, so it's not stuff that was taped back in the day.
But Russo mentioned the fact that if it wasn't for Bret getting hurt, he thought that angle would have taken off.
Yeah, because they had plans that Bret would be the leader, which you wanted to mention, and we mentioned it on our review of the other nWo DVD. The actual third member originally, if you watch Beyond, what is it? No, it's Wrestling with Shadows. It's the Bret Hart one. If you watch that, when he's talking with WCW the first time, they're wanting to bring him in because they said Hall was the medium-sized guy, Nash was the big guy, and Bret Hart was going to be the little guy.
Mm-hmm.
But when Bret Hart didn't do the contract, decided to stay with WWE, stayed about another 8 months, was it?
Something like that. It was almost a year.
Almost a year. But when they did that, that's when they switched gears and did Hogan.
It actually was a year because he came back for Survivor Series, and the Screwjob was the next Survivor Series.
Yeah, and that's when they went with Hogan. But Bret Hart, a lot of people don't know, was the original third member, supposedly. That's the rumor. That's
but
the rumor.
But you look at timelines, it fits perfect, though.
Yeah. And you can watch Wrestling with Shadows and see him talking to WCW on there, and that's a documentary.
And then, well, it just all crumbled apart, you know. And it was done. I was telling George, I was working a job, and I ended up having to work Monday nights for like 3 weeks in a row. And there was, you know, NWO was there, and then they were gone.
Yeah.
You know,
it just kind of splintered apart, and WCW itself splintered apart. And then they brought him back in
2002. 2002, yeah. After everybody's contracts were able, over, and where they were able to come to work for Vince. Because I think they still had the contract was through who? Was it Time Warner?
Time Warner, yeah.
So when their contracts were up with Time Warner, then they weren't work for Vince.
Yeah, and they brought the core NWO members, Hall, Nash, and Hogan in. And then they added guys. They added Six again. They added Giant again. Booker T, Shawn Michaels. And they even talk about it here, how it never had the same feeling in WWE that it had in WCW. Because, again, they lost... Once they did the NWO Wolfpack versus NWO Hollywood, the black and white versus black and red, they lost the realism angle of it, and that's what killed it. And that's what drove the stake in the heart.
So I want to ask you your opinion on the DVD. What was your biggest shock of seeing? Was it the Russo and Luger? Or, you know, that shocked me to see them on the DVD, because I didn't know they were...
The biggest shock, and it's the only... And you watch a lot of DVDs with me. You watch a lot of wrestling with me. I mean, we do these reviews. The only thing I rewound on this was to make sure I seen that they said Joe Hennig instead of Michael McGillicuddy. I was shocked.
Another thing I was kind of, not really shocked about, but Nash was really...
critical.
Very critical. Especially with Hogan, with the interview, like I was saying earlier. He really wanted this thing to work, and he thought Hogan was going to kind of tear it apart.
Yeah, which is probably mostly true.
Well, you know,
and he even talks about when he stopped caring, and that's part of the reason, because there was lack of direction there, and literally anybody could go up and say, "Hey, I'm going to do this week," and they'd be like, "Okay, go out there."
All right, buddy.
And a lot of the rumors from the time is that there was a script, but it was literally being written as the show was going on. There was no long-term plans.
Yeah, they said that in the rise and fall of WCW, that you know, you didn't know if you were working that night or not.
And they would bring 60 people to the show, and only 20 would work.
You know, the one thing right now, everybody for a long time never really considered Hogan the way Hogan was. Everybody put a lot of the blame of the fall of WCW on Hall and Nash.
Yeah.
More Nash than Hall. I honestly think since the years have gone by and you can see how Hulkster acts, I think a lot of it falls on the Hulkster.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. I always kind of had the feeling Hogan had an ego problem. I kind of think that's why Bobby Heenan always was anti-Hogan, because Heenan's an old school guy and he thought that the ego issues.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, Hogan thinks he's bigger than wrestling. He said it several times as a heel. And I really think that's what he feels. This was the biggest thing that ever, probably one of the biggest things that ever happened in wrestling was the NWO, as well as Hulkamania. So the devil does get his due, but his ego also destroyed a lot more. It killed WWF in the late 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and it was part of the reason that WCW died. And it's part of the reason that people don't watch TNA right now because of Hulk Hogan, not because TNA has horrible talent and doesn't put on a good show. People are sick of Hulk Hogan and his bullshit.
Well, the thing with Hogan or the NWO was the hugest thing in wrestling. I mean, you could say Stone Cold and everything like that, but you got to look for what it was. It was before Stone Cold, and it brought a lot of eyes to television.
And it was before the internet, so a lot of it was still
pop culture revolved around the NWO. But really, inside the faction, nobody got big except, I mean, like you said, Conan got a little bit bigger, but Hogan always had to be on the top, the tip top of the food chain, And other guys that fought the faction got big, Goldberg, DDP, everything like that. But really, Hogan made sure he was top dog.
And it's like I said to you, I can only remember one classic nWo match, which was Savage versus DDP at one of the Halloween Havocs. That's the only classic match I can remember involving the nWo.
I liked the Bash at the Beach match.
But it's not a classic.
No, but
it's a classic term.
Exactly. But the match beforehand was good.
Yeah. But anyway, overall, what would you give the DVD?
I give it a 4 stars.
I'm actually going to give it a 5 for the surprises on there and the fact that I went in with lowered expectations, thinking it would just be a rehash. I give it a 5.
Mm-hmm.
But pretty much that's all I got. You got anything else you need to add?
I don't have nothing else.
This has been our Heel Heat review of nWo The Revolution. My name is George Coles.
Gary Rhodes.
And we'll see you guys on the next review.